Dr. Talbot, how much funding does your group have nationally to do research on contaminants? How big is that budget or pot of money available to your group?
Ballpark number would be about $3 million for research on contaminants. And if we add monitoring to that, it's probably goes to $6 million. But strictly speaking, it would be $3 million for research throughout Canada.
Dr. McDonald, in your view, who should have responsibility for research and regulating impacts of non-point source contaminants in the marine and aquatic environment?
Well, this would be my view. I definitely think that whoever does it needs to have a good understanding of the marine resources and their life habits. That's certainly a very important component. You can't monitor a system without understanding what it is you're monitoring. That expertise resides with DFO. So I see DFO as being definitely implicated in running it or being a full partner in it.
Moving on to some pesticide questions, Dr. McDonald. Does the Department of Fisheries and Oceans communicate science advice on pesticides to the province to its integrated pest management section?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And what about, for both Dr. McDonald and Dr. Talbot, is there a formal mechanism for DFO Science to provide advice to Environment Canada regulators? I start with you, Dr. McDonald.
None that I'm aware of. We certainly have conversations that run below the formal level. And the best recent case I can think of is when Environment Canada was looking at regulating the flame retardants. And there we felt that DFO had a lot of expertise and a lot of interest in how that regulation went. Environment Canada was a lead agency and it was their responsibility to do the regulation, but they had called for stakeholders to provide input before they made their decision, and we felt it was very important that DFO would make a statement of what its position was. That was a difficult process, and certainly there was not something that was clean and easy to do.
And Dr. Talbot?
Yeah, I have basically the same answer. There's no formal process. However, there are some specific conversations. Again, it's on it depends on the issue. It'll be between managers or between scientists as they develop the information necessary to provide the best advice for risk assessment or other such process.
And Dr. McDonald, as I understand it, the CSAS process, the science advice process for DFO, which we've heard about already in these hearings, is available if a request is made through that process for science advice to DFO Science. Is that right?
That is correct. I believe it can also be operated in a bottom-up manner. It's not hard to send a message up and say something is important and then have a top-down command to do it.
All right, but it does require that top-down command as you described it?
Yes.
And is that process adequate in your view for getting science advice to Environment Canada or regulators where it's needed?
No, I don't think it is. It wasn't designed for that.
Okay. It's designed for answering questions posed, not advising upwards.
It's designed for answering questions posed and basically within DFO advice, to bring science advice to management within DFO. You can Google CSAS and you can see the kinds of reports and get a pretty good grasp of what it does.
Dr. Talbot, earlier you had spoken about the kinds of research that your department engages in. And you talked about fates and transport research and toxicology. And I just wanted to confirm, is any of that work being done for Pacific salmon right now?
No, there's no work under our mandate right now that we're doing specifically for Pacific salmon.
And that includes ecosystem research on the Fraser, is that right? You're not doing ecosystem research on the Fraser?
That's correct. No ecosystem research on the Fraser at present.
Right. And the Environment Canada does do research on pesticides, though, and how does that take place?
They're basically a number of ways that we can do research on pesticides. The most important one is through an agreement with PMRA, the Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency. They have funded over the years a pesticide science fund that Environment Canada uses to look at fate and transport and effects of pesticides to non-target organisms as the pesticides are distributed in ecosystems. And that process over the years has been anywhere between $300,000 to $1 million over the last 5 years, at least that I'm aware of, in my position as director. There is also some work that we do on pesticides because they're related to specific ecosystem issues. For example, if we're doing contaminants in an area of concern, and we'd like to understand what's happening in the specific areas of concern, we will look at a list. We will try to attempt to understand the priority contaminants in those areas of concerns, either in the water or in the sediments. And in that kind of process, we'll look at pesticides, or we'll look for pesticides and report on them. And there's also some additional work on pesticides as we try to advance our work on providing relevant information for enforcement and compliance. So over the years, we have done some work on pesticides in the context of what kind of buffer zones do we need between application areas and water bodies to ensure that pesticides don't run off into rivers and streams.
You referenced the funding agreement you had with PMRA. Is that agreement still in place? Are you still receiving funding from PMRA to do pesticide research?
The agreement is still in place, and I believe it's a continuous agreement. I don't think there's a termination date on the agreement. In terms of the funding, I think this year it is being discussed. Levels of funding are currently continue to be discussed at a higher level. I'm not aware exactly of what the envelope could be or would be this year.
Last year, was there funding for pesticide research?
Last year, we had about $300,000 for pesticide research and about another $300,000 for monitoring of pesticides.
Has the funding under that agreement decreased over the years?
It has decreased in the 5 years that I'm aware of since I've been in Environment Canada. It's gone from $1 million to about that amount that I just stated.
Okay. And if there is no funding provided in the funding envelope for this year, is there another agency that would do the kind of work on pesticides that is being done right now by Environment Canada?
Not to my knowledge, no. The work that's done on pesticides, fate and transport and effects to non-target organisms is work that Environment and Canada alone has been doing in recent years.
You talked about some different research that's done by your group on pesticides outside of the PMRA funded work. What proportion of your budget is spent on that pesticide work that's not associated with PMRA?
Oh, it would be a very small amount, perhaps 5% of our research budget.
Yeah, are pesticide work, is it considered part of Environment Canada's mandate?
Pesticides are pesticide research in terms of an environmental contaminant is part of our mandate. However, it's a little bit, there's a fine line here and perhaps some level of discussion exactly what the responsibilities are. PMRA asked us to look at the non-target effects and environmental fate of pesticides as it develops the approval process and regulations for use of those pesticides in a Canadian environment. work on the effectiveness of pesticides and best practices for use of pesticides belongs more in Agriculture Canada, to my understanding. So our mandates is strictly restricted to pesticides as a potential environmental contaminant under SEPA.
And are pesticides on the domestic substances list?
Not to my knowledge, no. The Environment Canada right now is working on is going down the list of contaminants that have been identified through a lengthy process as substances in commerce through the Chemical Management Plan. And that list is developed by another group, risk assessment people. And they need information from our scientists to determine if those substances should be managed as toxic substances. And pesticides are not a priority in the Chemical Management Plan. And supporting the Chemical Management Plan is our priority right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are my questions for these two witnesses. Canada will be the next questioner.
Mr. Commissioner, Mark East for the Department of Justice. I'm with my colleague Charles Fougere. And I have about 25 minutes. I hope to be done before that time. Dr. McDonald and Dr. Talbot, I have a few questions. I just wanted to step back a bit and talk a little bit about the terminology and discuss the respective mandates of the two departments. And maybe my first question is for Dr. McDonald. Your unit, I understand, is the Marine Environmental Quality Section of the Institute of Ocean Sciences. And I just wanted to ask you about, does that mean that your unit only does toxic chemicals research within the marine environment? Marine being ocean, saltwater environment?
No, not entirely. We do research on contaminants as they affect fisheries resources, and that certainly has included freshwater resources at times.
And would that be particularly the case with respect to anadromous species like salmon?
I think probably that yes is the simple answer, and partly because they're marine fish that come back and are reared and breed in lakes, but certainly we have had an interest in them because they're an iconic species as well.
Okay. I also want to talk a little bit about, we hear the term point source contaminants versus non-point source contaminants and the respective mandates of the departments. And I just want to clarify something, and maybe we can go to, it's tab 4, exhibit 975. And just as a question for Dr. Talbot. And this is the email from Robin Brown of DFO, and I just want to get your opinion, Dr. Talbot, on the paragraph that starts number 2. And maybe I'll just read it again. I'm sorry, thanks, Brenda. This is an area of complex jurisdiction. Health Canada PMRA regulates the use of pesticides. EC focuses on point source deposition of deleterious substances under the Fisheries Act. DFO worries about more subtle ecosystem impacts of primarily non-point sources, like surface runoff and complex mixtures of contaminants that are poorly addressed, with EC's primary emphasis on point sources. This is exactly the kind of problem that is likely to slip through the research and regulatory cracks. I guess my first question for Dr. Talbot is, would you agree with this characterization of Environment Canada's mandate with respect to regulation of non-point source contaminants?
If you're asking the specific question about the regulatory process, I think there might be some better people to answer that than I. But I can tell you from a research perspective that we make no real distinction between point and non-point sources. We have research activities that concern contaminants, whether they're dispersed from a point source like effluents, or whether they're dispersed through the air and transported through the air, like pesticides and other volatile substances. Our research is focused really on contaminants as a concern for ecosystem health and also a concern for the water quality standards that we're committed to provide information on through SEPA, for example. So from the research perspective, I don't think this point 2 is really accurate from a research perspective.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe just follow up with on this email with Dr. McDonald. I just want to get a sense of, to the extent to which your unit does research into non-source point contaminant work. I note, for example, on this email, if you scroll down a bit, there are some references to Peter Ross and some papers, and I know his name has appeared a lot. And is there a distinction made in your unit between work done on point sources or non-point sources, as far as a distinction that you're supposed to be drawing within DFO or within your unit?
No, there's not a particular distinction that we're instructed to consider here. I think it's, as Dr. Talbot has said, in a way the problem is different depending on whether you're talking about regulatory or you're talking about effects in the environment. For regulatory people, it makes a very big difference about point sources and distributed sources, because you have to tackle those very differently. In terms of an animal that's living in the environment that's receiving some of this and some of that, it's more about what it has to deal with and where it comes from that becomes important, in which case we try to understand the receptor and DFO. Our research perspective has been the receptor and whether or not harm is being done, and then trying to understand which agents it is that are causing that harm. That then would feed into policy to the regulatory side.
I want to talk a little bit about the context, or the funding environment that your units have been in the last 5 to 10 years, and maybe to help out with that, I'd like to go to Commission's documents, tab 14. And these are really questions for Dr. McDonald as they relate to DFO. Now, this is CAN 394637, and it's a paper entitled Strategic Review of Toxic Chemicals Research in the Environmental Science Program and the Arctic Science Program, Science Sector, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, dated June 9th, 2003. Dr. McDonald, are you familiar with this document?
I've seen it, yes.
And is this the strategic review? Is that what led to the changes that you testified about earlier in your testimony?
I think this was one step along the way. I'm not sure that this was the initial step. We had earlier meetings, and we have been going along this road for quite a while, I think, in DFO. Certainly, this would have been a prelude, though, looking at how we emphasize our research with limited funds.
I thought maybe this is a useful, if we go to page 3 of this document, ringtail page 3, because it provides maybe a little bit of context for, I think, some of these discussions. Maybe starting with and this is the executive summary, and maybe I just want to ask you some questions about what was going on at the time. In the second paragraph, there's a reference to, as a follow-up to the science assessment, the National Science Directors Committee. And I've just stopped there. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Can you explain what that committee is?
Basically, there are a set of directors, high-level executives in Ottawa, and they meet at times to work out DFO priorities and match things like budgets to responsibilities.
And so, continuing on in that sentence, they directed that a review of the toxic chemicals research within DFO be undertaken for the period 1997-98 to 2001-2002. The goal of the review was to conduct an assessment of the relevance, success, and effectiveness of DFO's past effort on toxics research, and provide options on the future direction of the department's research on toxic chemicals. The review was conducted within the context that the departmental status quo remains non-viable and was based on information received from regional environmental science managers, clients, and the science project inventory. Can we stop there? What does it mean that the status quo remains non-viable?
In my view, and I didn't write this text, but I read into it that the non-viability has to do with the amount of funding, resources available within the department to carry out its mandate, and the amount of funding required to do all of the kinds of research that were proposed. So what I read here is that there's not enough funding to continue to give, to put into this kind of research.
And I'm going to let you take a drink of water, Dr. McDonald, and then we'll ask
Sure.
the next question to Dr. Talbot. And maybe just follow with Dr. Talbot. Is it your sense in the period of time that we're talking about, I'm going to say the last 5 to 10 years, has this been generally a period of fiscal restraint in the area of toxic chemicals research and science research generally in your department?
That question is in my experience, that the question is, it depends a little bit on the context, on the priorities within water science and technology,
Right.
Or science and technology branch in general. In some years, we found that the water contaminant research agenda was extremely high priority activity. For example, in the last 2-3 years, oil sands impact has been a very high priority within my division, and we've been funded at the level that we needed to investigate oil sands as a hotspot, as an ecosystem issue. And in other years, though, funding is allocated elsewhere. I would say in general, our funding levels for water contaminant research has declined somewhat, or has remained stable, while the cost of doing business has increased somewhat over the last 5 years that I've been as a director. The allocation of resources is more of a variable among priorities than the department's overall budget, I would say.
Now, if I may follow up on this theme, what I'd like to do now, perhaps I should mark this document as an exhibit. I think we'll probably hear more about it in the next panel. If I can mark this this paper, Strategic Review of Toxic Chemicals Research.
Mr. East, I just,
Certainly.
980?
which tab? This is the one in tab 14, is it?
Tab 14 of the Commission's
Right.
list of
Thank
documents. Thank you. On the same thing, I'd like now to turn to tab 1 of Canada's list of documents. And Dr. McDonald, I don't know if you've seen this particular document. It's a deck, obviously, with the same title, Strategic Review of Toxic Chemicals Research, presentation to NSDC, June 17, 2003. Have you seen this before, or do you know anything about this
I
document?
had not seen it until this proceedings here.
Okay, what I thought I would do is perhaps just take you to some slides and just ask you some questions. Use this as a foundation for some questions I'd like to ask you about what was happening at this time. Maybe go to page 5 of the document. And the first bullet, toxic chemicals research is relevant to DFO's mandate and to addressing client needs. The second bullet is interesting. I just want to ask you something about this. Toxics research effort was allocated, and this is in 2003, or at the time, 5-year time period prior to that. Biological effects, 51% of the projects, and I think this is national. And chemical fate and transport, 42% of projects. Can I stop you right there and ask, you heard some testimony about fate and transports. Can you maybe just discuss a little bit what the difference is between work that's focused on biological effects versus work that's focused on chemical fate and transport?
Biological effects has to do with when a aquatic resource, a fish in a broad context, is exposed to some chemical or chemicals, whether or not that triggers a harmful effect, which in scientific jargon we'd say turns it from a contaminant into a pollutant. We see something happen. For example, you could impair reproduction. And so that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Specifically, you're trying to match exposures to something that happens to the fish. The chemical fate and transport has to do with a system science of understanding why the fish has that chemical in it anyway. Where is it getting it from? Who is putting it into the system? Is it long-range transport? Is it local industry? Where does it come from? And if you do the science right, you could also answer the question that if you withdrew resources or withdrew sources, you turned off the tap for some of these, you could project how long and how much the contaminant would turn down and whether it would come down below levels of toxic concern.
And then I want to go to tab 9 to follow on this discussion about biological effects. I'm sorry, page 9, not tab 9, I apologize. And I'm jumping around a bit in this document. I'm going to go back to some earlier slides, but I just wanted to continue this theme. In this deck, it talks about new directions. In the first bullet, maintain adequate in-house expertise for toxic chemicals research. In your view, has this objective been maintained?
Over the past few years, I think we've been losing this expertise. We certainly have been losing the expertise on pathways because we haven't supported that. We still have a lot of remainder expertise on it, but we're not developing new expertise in that direction.
Okay. And the second bullet in particular, allocate higher priority to studies on biological effects on toxic chemicals on fishery resources and habitat, and lower priority to standalone studies on fate or residues not linked to effects. Is this your understanding of where DFO was going after this?
Yes.
Okay. And so that number we saw earlier of 51% versus 42%, they wanted to change that ratio to make it even wider, I suppose.
They wanted to remove the 41%, I think, really.
Has that 41% disappeared entirely in the last 5 years?
Yes.
Because I was wondering if, well, maybe I'll go back to the previous slide, slide 8. And this is I believe this chart actually is in the policy and practice report. I may be wrong about that, but I've seen it. I think I saw it there. But this is a chart that talks about ESSRF allocations. That's the fund that you talked about earlier for the time period 1997 to 2003. And if you look on the left, it says total toxic chemical funding reduced from 11.6 million to 7 million to address other pressures. And there was a bump up, I think, in 2001, 2002 to address concerns on new chemicals. Is that a trend that you saw, that you've seen over time, a decline in funding for toxic chemical research?
Yes. Within DFO.
Within DFO?
Yes.
And maybe go down to the last line. It says, ESSRF funding decreased due to realignment to other priority areas. Maybe just put it this way. Why do you think that toxic chemical research funding as a standalone function has been declining? Well, I'll just leave it at that. Why do you think that has been the case?
Well, you're asking for my opinion.
Yes.
And I've not been party to NSDC meetings and other things, but I think really that DFO, as all departments, have a lot of priorities, a lot of mandate to do. And I think they were strapped for funding, and they looked over their mandate and asked some hard questions about what it is they had to cut. Generally, you have in my view, you have two kinds of cuts you can make. We offer up efficiency cuts and trimming of fat and all that, but there comes a point when that doesn't work anymore and you have to do some kind of amputation. And in the 2005 meeting, I think the decision had come to the point of whether or not DFO would excise the contaminants work entirely. I mean, I think that was really on the table from what I heard and what I saw. They came back to a position of saying, well, let's maintain an expertise, but we have to limit it, and it will be limited to this. We will maintain our laboratories. I think that was a wise decision, and we will make those more efficient. I think that was a wise decision. And we will limit our research to toxic effects on fish, with fish, a broad context fish. And that way we will save this amount of dollars, and they will go to other priorities that are above this priority.
And would you agree that's kind of reflected, at least for this 5-year time period, by this chart that's in front of you on page 8, where The yellow bar is coming down, toxic chemical research. Some of the other ones, oil and gas is a good example, are becoming greater priorities for the funds that are available. Is toxic chemicals research a subcomponent of some of these other areas?
It could be. You could cast a research proposal for habitat with some contaminants in it, and you could do likewise with hydroelectric development. And certainly if oil and gas comes into the picture, yes, pesticides are clearly toxic chemicals. So they are a little bit embedded into other proposals quite often, yes.
And maybe if we can go back just to page 8 again, page 9, sorry. If you look on the third bullet, focus on solving practical problems that are essential to DFO's mandate obligations and needs of clients. Is this a reference to MASH focusing the work more on responding, I guess, to priorities identified by DFO in other areas, like supporting other areas of DFO science?
I'm not sure exactly what's meant here. I can read into it what I think is meant, but I'm not sure what is meant.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. And then just over on the page 10, maybe just to close this off, just some of the other, I'm going to ask you about these. New directions continued. Develop alternative delivery for science functions that can be done outside of DFO. Do you know what that's referring to? Do you have a sense?
Again, I'd have to guess.
Okay. Well, maybe the next bullet, I'm curious if this has occurred. Investigate strengthening relationship between DFO, Environment Canada, and universities through virtual centers, especially in freshwater toxicology.
It sounds like a good idea, but I have no recollection that any such was done.
Okay. And third bullet, clarify science, roles, and responsibilities of DFO and Environment Canada and strengthen cooperation. I think we've heard some discussion.
Again, it sounds like a good thing to do, but I'm certainly not clear that something was done.
And enhance partnering with universities, OGDs, and industry. Is that something that's happened in the last 5 years?
In my experience, that has happened, and it's been driven largely by the scientists themselves, because when they can't get the funding from DFO, of course, they are going to look for partnering and other funds. Myself, I work in what's called ArcticNet. It's a large network. It's a university network, and I become an adjunct professor somewhere to do that. I also collaborate with industry when I see there's something that we can do that makes sense and will serve understanding of contaminants. So that has been done, not, I don't think, with direct guidance, but because it's a product of removing other sources of funding.
I like the mark as an exhibit, Canada's tab number 1. Strategic review of toxins. Thank you.
Uh, 981.
I'll just finish up with one more question. I'm interested in tab 5. So if we go to tab 5, exhibit 976. And this is one of my favorite references in the first line. It talks about the area of tension with the Environment Canada and DFO. And DFO is largely withdrawn from the contaminants research field, at least on paper. There are still internally subversive elements at work, and I'll leave it up to your imagination to decide where those elements might be located. Is that actually a reference to you, Dr. McDonald, and your team?
Well, quite likely I'm implicated, but I don't think I'm alone. We do maintain some things, and in some ways it's doing two jobs instead of one job, but yeah, I'd be one of those subversive elements.
And this is maybe I could paraphrase, is this an example of where you and your unit have been doing work in this area, but have been having a constant struggle to find funding to do it?
Yes. If I could add,
yeah, please do.
My view, and this is something that I think is really an important question to ask. What is the role of a government scientist? And I think the number one thing is to provide sound advice to the government of the day. And to do that, I think in science, you want your scientists working at the edge. And whether or not they're exactly on the topic that's crucial of the day is not as much to the question of whether or not their science is relevant, can guide policy, and is informative about things coming at us. In other words, I feel like we have let the system down if management tells us about an emerging problem and not the other way around. So my perspective is that there's things we should be doing that sometimes are not necessarily on the exact mandate but are coming at us.
Well, actually, I think that's probably a really good place to leave my questions, and I'll thank the witnesses, and I'll turn it over back to Wendy.
So my name is Cliff Prowse. I'm the lawyer for the provincial government, and I should preface my questions by saying that funding shortages are not confined to the federal government, in my experience, and so that leaves, I think, the province in a similar position that the federal government is demonstrating in these emails that we've just discussed. As a participant in this inquiry, I'm struck by the fact that we've had 12 or so science reports, almost all of which recommend further research be done with respect to each of the different subjects within there. And I guess the one that maybe is most relevant to this panel is the contaminant report, which put the whole question of chemicals and endocrine disruptors in a somewhat alarming context. And I think the implication of that is that a lot of money should be spent somewhere by somebody doing a lot of research on that. So my question is, within the two exhibits that we just seen, where would that decision be made within government, and how would that decision be made, and what discussions have there been about that? You seem to, Dr. McDonald, seem to be the lucky near retiree gets to answer these questions.
Normally, there's within DFO, those decisions are made top down. We do not make decisions on government priorities or departmental priorities at the bench level. Having said that, we do have mechanisms, briefing notes, and discussions to inform our management about what we see as urgent issues. And when we had an ESSRF program, we had review, and the ADM would go to those and listen to what we had to say, and sometimes we'd have these toxicochemical reviews and perspectives would be developed, and then we would get a mandate that would come down. The orders, if you'd like to put it that way, or the directions that were set from the top down, both in terms of text about what our priorities should be and in terms of the allotments of money, really. The second being probably the most relevant part, because that tells you how much something's important. That's how the process works.
Can you comment from an Environment Canada perspective?
Yeah, Environment Canada has got perhaps several ways of determining how funding is prioritized. We do have programs that become high-level priorities within Environment Canada. And for example, I come back again to the chemical management plan. Canada has to go through a very long list, several thousands of substances, and determine if those substances should be managed as toxic substances. And that mandate is urgent. We have a very little time to go through. There's international agreements to do that. So we have to put a lot of our resources towards that. And that uses quite a bit of our resources in that way. The issue of whether we should be continuing to work on an issue that's been a priority in the past, then falls not only in the context of these urgent requests, as the example I've just given you, but it also, as a report is produced, the question that is asked by management is sufficient information to address the deliverables that we had agreed upon, or is it sufficient to develop information necessary for a risk assessment or compliance of some nature? And even though it might be of great value to society to continue and do additional work, because resources are so short, and because we always have many more priorities and requests than we can fund, then we have to determine whether it's necessary or desirable to do additional work in this area or move on to something else, even though we may not have complete information.
These seem like very difficult choices, and again, at some perhaps likely oversimplified level, difficulties in forecasting are something that we're familiar with. I think there were difficulties in our context of forecasting the 2009 salmon run, which turned out to be very low. And once the commission got started, I don't think anybody anticipated that in 2010 there would be a record run. So that's not relevant, I don't think, to your exact fields. But the question I have is, isn't there a danger in setting priorities according to the perhaps the political need of the moment, that some basic research that needs to be maintained over time will be lost in the shuffle?
Of course, you're absolutely right. There is a risk in doing it this way, and in putting all of your energy on brush fires and emergencies. Sometimes it works out very well. I can tell you that the Northern Contaminants Program was well funded over a first 5-year period, and it got that funding because of a front page article in the Globe and Mail that said mother's milk on Broughton Island is unfit to drink. It had PCBs in it. So there are some of the ways that things get currency is that they get exposure in the media, and the media comes back to the political agenda, and the political agenda comes down. It can work for good and it can work for bad. I think this is one of those cases where you have to be careful what you wish for when you do these things, because you may get it. And in the case of the NCP, I can only say good things about it, about the collaboration that was done by government and universities to produce that work. So in that case, it worked very well. In the case of contaminants or other issues that come along occasionally and reach a fairly high profile in the mind of the political system or the media, there is risk in pulling away funds from long-term considered research and placing it onto short-term brush fires. I really think that is a risk, and it requires a certain amount of a body of inertia, if you like, of research that's forward-thinking and looking forward on these. And we've discussed monitoring before. Monitoring is part of that.
Do you have a comment on contaminants in particular, or generally? Do you have a comment?
Perhaps to add to that, I disagree with Dr. McDonald's comments. I agree with his comments in general. The only thing that I would add is that in our risk management of our, when we prioritize our project, we do an informal risk analysis of what our program ought to look like and what we need to get into. So I would not agree with your statement that we're dealing with just short-term issues. There is consideration for long-term monitoring or long-term assessments or projects that need to be carried over very long periods of time, and we do consider those in our appropriation of funds or distribution of funds to the different programs. For example, our Mercury Fate and Transport program has been ongoing for many years, and while some other projects need to be resolved within 1, 2 to 3 years, and those, once we have that answer, project is simply terminated and we move to something else.
If I could, I just would like to comment. I didn't mean to imply that Environment Canada was driven by short-term problems. All I meant to say was that there's risk in driving a system that way. I think Environment Canada does not do that, actually.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Hopkins-Etter, are you going to be asking questions?
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner, panel members. My name is Shane Hopkins-Etter, appearing for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I just have a few quick questions for Dr. McDonald. Mr. Lund, could you please bring up Commission April 2nd, 2009? Do you recognize this email?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Lund, could you please turn to page 4? In the middle of the page, there is an abstract, which says the abstract is a nice summary of the advice provided by this team. At the top of that page, Mr. McDonald, Dr. McDonald, I'm sorry, are you identified as one of the authors of this paper?
I am.
Looking at the lower part of that abstract, the last 5 or 6 lines starting with the sentence, the ready breakdown, just going to read a short part. You noted that the BDE-209 is insidious and is found to biomagnify in aquatic food webs. You also note, this is where I'm quoting, the ready breakdown of BDE-209 into more bioaccumulative and toxic, lighter PBDE forms in the environment presents perhaps the most insidious threat to aquatic biota. And you also note, you go on to note these PBDEs have endocrine disrupting potential. Now, the endocrine disruptors, you mentioned a couple of effects that these can have on fish health. Did you not, just this morning?
I did.
And those were sublethal effects. Can you tell me what they were again?
The ones that we worry about most are effects on reproduction and effects on immune function.
There are other effects, though, are there not? Just referring to PPR 14, Policy and Practice Report that we received. At paragraph 117, Mr. Lund, if you wish to bring it up, it lists a number of other effects, and you can confirm whether or not these are in fact some of the other considerations. Does it not also affect migration through effects on neurotoxicity or olfactory effects?
As I stated earlier, I'm not a toxicologist, and I don't count that my expertise. That question would be better put to Peter Ross.
Peter Ross?
Yes.
Okay. You are aware of these concerns, though?
I am.
Have you ever heard of endocrine disruptors affecting maturation rates?
I have.
And obviously that's something we should put to Peter Ross as well, as to those potential
That is
effects.
correct.
And are you aware that in the Commission technical report, this is Exhibit 826, this is tab 26 of the Commission binder, at page 143 under sufficiency, it actually talks about near the top of that page, the exposure to certain endocrine disrupting compounds such as PBDEs, PBBs has likely increased exponentially over the past 2 decades. Do you agree that it does in fact appear to be an exponential increase in the concentration?
Exponential increase is a particular form of increase, like a percentage increase where it curves upward. We have several different records of time series that have been created, and they all are not linear. They all increase upwards. So, yes.
And this has been over the last few decades?
It's been, I'm not sure exactly the time frame, but I'd say the past 2 decades about, yeah.
So, given all the concerns of the endocrine disruptors and the potential effects on fish health, do you not think that it's of utmost and critical importance to study these chemicals and these contaminants further, and to understand how they're getting into the environment so that we can limit those?
Yes, I think that's very true. I think even more important and urgent, and the reason we went to a CSAS document and tried to provide advice to Environment Canada was we felt that continuing to produce and use the 209 would be loading the environment with this chemical when we were really very uncertain about what its downstream effects would be. So we were more interested in providing a DFO science opinion on the regulatory process to Environment Canada.
How long was 209 in use?
I don't recall exactly when its use started, but 2 decades probably anyway.
Just turning to tab 8, this is exhibit 9, I believe this is exhibit 977, tab 8. I got the nod from the registrar. Just looking at that list, did you say, I didn't get everything that you said there. Did you say that it doesn't capture pharmaceuticals? What else is not captured by this list?
Well, if you look, the only new age modern chemical biomagnifier that you might worry about is AOX, organohalides. That's a measurement that was usually applied to pulp mills, especially ones using chlorine to make their products. So they're producing chlorinated products, and AOX means the X is a chlorine, and the AO part says that we actually don't know quite what it's stuck on because there are a lot of complicated compounds, but it's chlorinated. What's missing from this? Well, if you look at a top predator in any system, you'd expect to see things like endosulfan, chlordane, PCBs, PBDEs, DDT, it's still cycling, and there are others. None of those are in there.
And those are also, I believe, endocrine disruptors?
In various forms, endocrine disruptors, they also affect immune function. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Looks like it's time for the break.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.